Hi everyone, and welcome to this, I suppose, lesson video on William Blake's poem "London" from the Power and Conflict cluster of the poetry anthology. So, what this looks at today is obviously an introduction to the poem itself. We'll hear a recording of it, and just looking at some of the language, the techniques that are used in there, and looking at it as what it is really, a social commentary, a protest against a lot of things that the poet William Blake disagreed with. So this first part is just to give a bit of background on him, on his beliefs, on his thoughts, and kind of where he's coming from in terms of writing the poem. So it was written and illustrated. So if you look on the left of your screen there, that illustration is by Blake himself. So his background is not just as a writer and as a poet, but also as an artist, I suppose, through mediums such as engraving, in particular. So yeah, it was the first draft of it was written in 1792, and it's important to say the first draft because we're going to look at the differences in terms of how he edited it and how he changed it for the final version that's in front of you in your anthology. Interesting character, William Blake. In his anthology mugshot with the page on page 27, it is for London in your anthology. In that image, particularly, is said to have, when the artist asked him what he was sort of looking at within the room, he's supposed to have fixated on what he saw was an angel perched on the door for him. So he was someone who was, in that sense, quite eccentric, and he had a different kind of different way of seeing the world in many respects to most people, even most creators, most artists of his type. So the time that this is written in, time of great social and political change, and there's two main events really that are both inspiration for and referenced in the poem as well. So one is the Industrial Revolution, which took place in many parts of the developed world, but particularly in our country where it meant you had more like mechanized means of production, so you had more machinery instead of people doing things manually, and that did involve a lot of sort of child exploitation. So a lot of children were needed to work, and children were treated really quite appallingly, and that is a big inspiration for London. You get mentions of people from all different elements of society, but particularly children, and how badly they're affected. So that was something that angered him and something that's an inspiration. And secondly, so if I may, so this relates to ideas around the Industrial Revolution. So it says about the rioters of London as well. So obviously the civil unrest that was there as well. So obviously the poem's written just shy of 10 years later than that, but that's the kind of the background that it's coming from. Also in terms of the French Revolution, so this was where in France the rulers of the nation were overthrown by ordinary people essentially, and it was something he looked to for a lot of inspiration. It was something that he thought was quite admirable, and was hoping that in our country we could replicate that and do the same. There's references in the poem to people being sort of like chained by their own minds as well as the rules and restrictions put in by the government as well. Another thing as well is the mention of chimney sweeps. So I've said about how the treatment of children is mentioned in the poem as well, but you've also got here another poem he wrote here. So it's called The Chimney Sweeper. You'll see it's from the same collection of poetry. So the larger collection is stories of innocence and experience. Sorry, songs of innocence and experience. So yeah, you can see their same style of illustration, and as well as that, on the right hand side, you've got again an image of children of that time, of that sort of class. So you'd have children, sort of poor and orphan children, who'd be sold into apprenticeships for a really small amount of money, and it just showed how badly treated children were at that time. And this little stanza here is important, and I want you to sort of keep this in your mind and see how you can link this to the poem itself. So, because I was happy upon the heath and smiled along the winter's snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. So basically, that acknowledgement that he felt sort of doomed to this really sort of poor life. So yeah, all that remains here really is to look at the poem itself. So the version of the poem that's going to be that's going to follow this is read by Idris Elba, actually, interestingly. I thought I'd give you a break from my voice and one that's perhaps a bit more interesting than my own. Okay.
I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and marking every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening churches appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
Okay, so the poem itself, we're going to tackle stanza by stanza. What I've got here, as you can see on the left-hand side, is the original illustration, original engraving by Blake himself, and also, obviously, the version you can see in your anthology. Okay, so if you can turn to the page, if you haven't already, page 27. And there's a couple of things. Well, first I want us to start with, so as I said, we'll go through stanza by stanza, but one activity I'd like us to just think of first is the redrafting that took place by Blake. So I don't expect you to be able to sort of read this very clearly, but what you should be seeing there is a copy of the original manuscript, so the original handwritten draft produced by Blake. So, like I say, you'll probably be able to see very little because of the style of the handwriting and the age of the document. But you'll see that, for example, here, and mark in every face I meet, in the original draft was C, and here the mind-forged manacles, it was German-forged links I hear. So there's a number of those changes, and I want us to start by thinking about those before we get to actually analysing it stanza by stanza. So the first change, okay, and I want you to write these on the left, so they're going to appear down here. So the first change, it was I wander through each, instead of chartered, it was each dirty street, for obvious reasons. In the period this was written, so his first draft in 1792, published in 1794, public health and the sort of the overall environment in which people living in London was incredibly unhealthy, widespread disease, high rate of infant and child mortality. So not a very sort of pleasant environment to be growing up in. So that's the first change. The next one, instead of mark in every face I meet, it's the word C, the more obvious C. Marks of weakness, marks of woe was still there, but again, I want you already to be thinking of that level of repetition of that word mark and its potential meaning. So what's different in mark in every face I meet towards see in every face I meet? The next change, every infant's cry of fear was originally so instead of infant's cry of fear, it was the voice of every child, and you'll see there sort of running out of room slightly, just trying to be careful with that. And then a really interesting one here, instead of the mind-forged manacles, it was, and you'll have to probably just pop this one under here, German-forged links. So again, we're going to explore why the changes, why these differences. And what we'll do, probably we'll put them under here. I think will be the best place for those. And then this one as well, every blackening church appalls. It was previously blackens over church walls. So you've got a range of differences, range of contrasts there. And what I would like to just sort of think about here is, how is the meaning different in that first version? So the way I'd like you to do it is underneath the poem here. You'll do the rest of your annotation here. Underneath the poem, I want you just to So we've put line 1. Okay. So if we just put changes from first draft. So number 1, leave a little bit of space in between. So line 3. In any of the poems, you've got the line numbers there in multiples of 5, obviously. You've got line 6, line 8, and line 10. So what I'd like you to do is, for the changes in the first draft, for each one, I would like you to just jot down a few thoughts on how that would change the meaning. So, example, how would the poem be different if it said dirty street instead of chartered street, dirty Thames? What emphasis does that give, obviously, in terms of the environment, pollution, and so on? And obviously, see instead of mark. So to see something, obviously, it's just that you've taken it in, haven't you? You've witnessed it. But if you mark it, how would that be different? If you've seen something, you mark it. Think about how that might be something you kind of, you file away in your memory. Okay, shows a different effect perhaps that it's had on it. So just give it a go for each of those 5, and pause the video at this stage. And what we'll do is go through those, and then we'll get into each stanza after that. Okay, so hopefully I've had a chance to have a go at that, and some of those will be easier than others. So for example, dirty, again, instead of that, emphasises the filth, and this is a fantastic word as well, the squalor. So squalor being a noun, abstract noun, or squalid being the adjective, so just id instead of or, just relates to that sort of that unsanitary, unhealthy, filthy sort of living conditions that they have to endure. And again, the anger is a sort of recurring theme in this. He's angry at the establishment, i.e. the government, and the church comes under that as well, as we'll talk about shortly. Mark instead of see. Mark suggests, if you think you make a mark on something, it leaves a trace, doesn't it? So it's the idea, it's like affected him more deeply. Infant versus child. Infant being more innocent than a child, younger, more vulnerable. And again, I said there's greater emotional impact. One thing actually I haven't mentioned there, a cry of fear instead of the voice. So a cry instead of voice is more emotive, more extreme, isn't it? 8 as well, mind forged manacles. So manacles being chains, but it was German forged links. So links of a chain, and also manacles being those heavy iron chains typically worn by prisoners of the time as well. So we'll talk about this more when we go through each stanza as well. And the idea of them being German forged, we'll just park that, just keep that to one side for a time. And then finally, instead of blackens over church walls, so the idea of the pollution, this terrible state of affairs that he witnesses that makes him so angry, blackens the church itself, perhaps the physical church in that sense. Every blackening Church of Paul's is in what we call the active voice. It's saying the church is doing the blackening. So he's critical of the church in terms of saying it's not doing enough to help people in poverty around it as well. So again, that's part of his view as one of the Romantic poets. Very much someone against any sort of establishment institution, so like the church, like the government as well. So what we're just going to move on to now is a little look at the first stanza. Okay, so just readjust that. So yeah, I wander through each chartered street. So again, I'm going to just pick out a few things. Of course, you're welcome and even encouraged to pick out anything else that I've not got there. So it's not saying that I sort of have all the answers or a fountain of all knowledge on this. I want you to bring your own ideas, your own thoughts to this as well. So I think even the verb wander there, that'd be something I'd like you to explore as well. So I wander through each chartered street. So it's not as if he's gone looking for the poverty, is it? It's a wander is as a sort of a verb or as a type of journey. If you're using it as a noun, go for a wander. It's not anything with any sort of purpose or direction. It's just that this is what he finds virtually anywhere he goes within London as well. Here as well, so we thought about chartered street, chartered Thames. So the streets and the Thames, the River Thames, obviously, they're actually parts of the landscape, the architecture. So if remember we said chartered means sort of owned, and in this case owned privately, so not by the country or by the government itself, but owned sort of privately. That idea of things being chartered, that everything is owned by someone. Think about what that suggests about London itself. You know, if it's something that everything is like in people's hands, it owned. Someone like Blake would obviously believe, you know, that London, the city, it's everybody's. It belongs to the people, but chartered suggests quite the opposite. And then you'll start to see here that the word every is repeated quite frequently. Mark in every face I meet. So every face I meet there, right? I'd explore that as a noun phrase. So what does that suggest about how far some of these issues go? Okay, so what I want from this is not you just simply copying what I've put. I want you to think about what's the meaning of these. So for all of these parts, I want you to sort of add your own detail to it. I'm not going to do it on this clip, but I will share like the sort of the finished product when I've annotated everything. But I want you guys to have a go at that as well there as well. And then marks of weakness and marks of woe. So these are also noun phrases as well. So marks of weakness. So a noun phrase is the noun, is the thing, either an object or a concept or an idea, plus any other description or sort of modification of it. So in this one, it's face. And these are interesting actually because the marks are the actual physical, you know, what you can see. So the marks of weakness is people's poor health. Marks of woe is the struggle, the difficulty they've got on there. So there's actually different nouns in there. So marks of weakness, they're sort of the main nouns in there as well. Weakness and woe then are both abstract nouns too. Do try and keep your notes slightly neater than mine. Obviously, I should possibly be using a ruler for this, so yeah, I will make sure to go back over those and do that. So yeah, first stanza, anything else that you notice as well, and just what's the overall impression of that. So I would try over in this sort of area, obviously to extend, you know, in terms of these. So what do they suggest? What does that suggest? And make some further notes on that and anything else that you see in there. So I want you at this stage to pause the clip, add your extension to those notes at your own pace, and then continue after that. Okay, so the second stanza, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So again, you've got every repeated, every cry, every man. And again, you've got that word cry turning up, haven't you? You've got cry turning up time and again. So thinking about that, the actual meaning of that word in terms of cry, it's that sense of despair. So cry of fear we mentioned when we talked about the changes in the first draft. Sorry, just going over me underlines here. Top tip, if ever you shouldn't ever, I know I've given a bad example there, underline with that ruler, going back over it will improve the look of it. So every cry of every man, every infant's cry of fear, so that cry being repeated voice. So there's a lot of, I want you to think of the sort of the sound imagery that's used there as well. The so it's spelt differently, but you've got the oral, so that AU you'll know that from, say, like audio, for example, or something's audible, meaning you can hear it. So oral imagery and the sounds. So what does that add up to? So there's all these different sounds. It becomes this kind of you know, think of that sort of that backdrop, that soundtrack of it. And in terms of this, the mind-forged manacles, I want you to think of this. So in terms of that,
the idea of the sort of German forged links as well, that refers to the use of sort of German, what were called mercenaries, used to keep the peace there as well. So, and that's to sort of stop any kind of revolution happening as well. So it relates to, the German mercenaries used to keep order and stop a revolution. And as part of your work on this, this next part, so when I invite you to pause it this time, I want you actually thinking of the definitions of mercenary. So that would just be with a Y instead of the IES, and also revolution. So I would like the definitions of each of those, please, as part of your notes. And voice every ban, so about that idea of it being sort of restrictive. And I just asked you to think about the sort of the sounds in this one as well. So it's this oral imagery, the sounds, and then this idea of mercenaries and revolution as well. So every cry, and also the repetition of every. What does that do? Okay, so every. So it's another word, like suggests, implies what? Okay, so that's another thing I would like you to do as well. So 3 things there to have a go at. Pause it. Let's just get that in so you can see it actually. I do apologise. So stop a revolution was the end of that sentence there too. So I want you to pause it now, and I want you to look at these 3 things. Again, do it at your own pace. Pause for as long as you need to. Main thing with that, I want it to be your work. And the good what this situation, unusual as it is, does give us a chance for you guys to work at your own pace on that as well. Okay, so 3rd stanza. Interestingly here, they mention about the chimney sweeper. And again, in this poem, a lot of it is Blake's anger, frustration at the appalling living conditions people live in at the time. And this part, the chimney sweeper's cry, he actually wrote a poem as part of his this bigger collection, so Songs of Innocence and Experience, as it was called, the whole collection. The chimney sweeper's cry. Wrote a poem about called The Chimney Sweeper, and one stanza of that's interesting. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled along the winter's snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. So that word woe, W-O-E, from the first stanza is actually present in one of his other poems in this connection as well. Collection, sorry, I should say. So first line about chimney sweeper, every blackening church appalls. We mentioned that down here, but I want you to think about the verb choice there of appalls. Okay, so you might need to look at the definition of that and think about what suggestions is there is what is he making about the church. So you could say that's a pointed, meaning it's directed at someone, pointed criticism, right? What's he saying there about that? And this bit's really interesting. So the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. This bit, okay, is a direct link to French Revolution. And there's, as an extension to this, what would be a really good extra task is to do a little bit of research on that French Revolution. Blake himself, as we've said, was a big supporter of the French Revolution. He watched it with great interest and felt that in this country, why weren't we doing that? So things like mind-forged manacles about how people are trapped even within their own thoughts. It's not just the government creating those. Restrictions. And actually, I'm going to just nip back and do that. Not just the government creating it, but it's sort of the self-made chains there as well. So self-made, as in it's people putting themselves. I want you to extend that. People putting themselves under those restrictions as well. So runs in blood down the palace walls. And what he wanted to do is to kind of to people to start this revolution. So again, we should have had a look at the meaning of revolution. It's something I really want you to do. If you've not done that yet, maybe a little mini pause here to go and do that. And this bit as well, hapless soldiers sigh. To be hapless means to be quite vulnerable, to have very little sort of chance of success, almost to be someone who is, you might have heard the phrase a sitting duck, someone who's just waiting there to be attacked or is defenseless. So it's about this sort of ordinary people protecting the wealthy, or sacrifice for the wealthy. Okay. So yeah, for the third stanza, again, can you see any other links there as well? So is there anything else that kind of ties back to what we've read so far in the poem? So yeah, take another pause at this stage and look at the third stanza, please. Okay, and finally, fourth stanza. Most through midnight streets I hear. So again, there's something there for setting. I would definitely look at midnight streets. Also the idea of I hear constantly. There's that sensory idea, isn't there? We talked about oral imagery in stanza 2. The youthful harlot's curse. And I want you to explore that as a noun phrase. So the youthful being the adjective, harlot being the noun. So harlot is another word for prostitute. So the youthful harlot's curse. So youthful harlot, again, the idea that a lot of this is about and one of the reasons why Blake was so opposed to the Industrial Revolution. So again, we've got two revolutions in action here. The French Revolution, where ordinary people were overthrowing those in charge, literally storming palaces and killing their rulers, and the Industrial Revolution, where there's moved towards sort of mass production, kind of new machinery, and on a scale never seen before, and that involved a lot of child exploitation. Hence his reference to chimney sweeper and the subsequent poem he wrote about that. But also, think about the lack of opportunities really as well. So youthful harlot, about someone possibly too young for it really, being driven into that kind of life. And blasts the newborn infant's tear. Blasts again as a verb. Think about the powerful nature of that. And the newborn infant's tear again as a noun phrase. What is that phrase saying to us? How is that emotive? How does it link to what we've talked about here? So you could say it refers to. So what does that tell us about? We said about a lot of, the poor health people had, about their rates of infant mortality. And this is interesting as well. Blights with plagues, the marriage hearse. And again, marriage hearse. Okay, as a little noun phrase in there as well. So it's part of a bigger highlight there, but the marriage hearse. So I want you to think about that as well. If you've not heard of the word hearse before, I want you to look it up, and then from that, sort of add some notes on that too. But this blights with plagues, suggestion of that is this youthful harlot is it's a transmission of disease, probably of sort of STI, of venereal disease. Youthful harlot blights with plagues the marriage hearse, so that being passed on to a man who then passes that on to his wife. So it's quite a sort of a grim and stark image, but that's the suggestion there. Blights with plagues the marriage hearse, the plagues being that transfer of disease. So that's one opinion on it. But it's if you think about that as well, blasts the newborn infant's tear, blights with plagues the marriage hearse. This is a hopeless, desperate kind of situation where there is very little positivity, very little sort of goodness in that kind of setting. Okay, so if there's anything else you need to add, obviously add it now at the end of the video, and I'll make sure there's some links and some other materials to help you with your work on London. So it's one we really will sort of get stuck into, and it gives you a good opportunity to get these poems kind of, at least in the first instance, ticked off. So yeah, get those notes down. Anything else that you can find through your own research, and there'll be other resources to follow. So thank you for watching.